Say what you will about the fate of the Ghostbusters franchise. Faced with a specter of similar decline, Americans remain dedicated to the proposition that they ain't afraid of no ghost. This is the land of ghost hunters, friendly ghosts, ghost dads, ghost world, ghost town, Scooby-Doo, and Beetlejuice, detectives who are mediums, and mediums who are detectives. Many say America is haunted by its ghosts. A weird claim considering how endlessly fascinated, curious, and all-around well-disposed we are toward them. There's just one problem. They're not real. What plagues us isn't a haunting. In our heads, on our streets, sometimes even in our sheets, those ain't no ghosts. They're America's myriad demons. Look at the face of the quintessential homeless person these days. The face of the quintessential protester. Something bizarre has been happening, and now it's everywhere, in plain sight. We're a long way away from hobo rail riders and trailblazing freedom riders. Public life is overrun with walking zombies on fentanyl and meth, with living Hieronymus Bosch paintings pridefully demanding their perverse performances be celebrated, joined in, worshipped. More and more, Americans are giving in to the recognition that the convincing explanation of what's happening to us involves the demonic, and sadly, more and more Americans are giving in to the demonic itself. This is no time for Ghostbusters. America needs an exorcism. But how can we spiritually purge the legacy of monsters like Jim Jones and Jeffrey Epstein, or the dark machinations of the so-called spooks running our nation's intelligence agencies? I'm James Poulos. Welcome to Zero Hour. With us today, one Darryl Cooper. He's probably America's spiciest and most savory chronicler of our long ride to hell in a handbasket, covering everything from death cults to civil rights at home, and from Ernst Junger's On Pain to the war in Ukraine abroad. He's a researcher, a writer, the creator of the Modern Made podcast, and the co-host of Unraveling with Jocko Willink. Darryl, how are you?
It's great to see you, man. I'm
good to see you. So, you've been mining these veins for a while, and people are eating it up. They want this information about the dark underbelly of America. They like the detail, the deep dives into our past, warts and all. What is it? What is it about this moment that is so captivating for people who want to sort of rediscover our very recent history? Usually, it's about the ancient lore, people wanting to go back, 12,000 years to figure out what really happened. But there's this hunger, too, for just like remembering what it is that we went through even within living memory.
Yeah, that's true. I think maybe the fact that we have kind of disintegrated the organs, the media, and the content production that used to unite us and sort of bring the American imaginary into alignment, that those things have sort of disintegrated, or they've become so lowbrow that they can't serve that function anymore. And so people they want to know. You said in the introduction, people are. You're quintessential protester or homeless person. Why? Just the whole nine yards. The Afghanistan withdrawal and how that went. Just all of these things. People have this sense that something has gone terribly wrong, and they're hungry for anything that might give them a sense of the history of that process. And it's a tough one. One of the things that you opened my eyes to, or maybe clarified for me, I should say, is when you mentioned somewhere, may have been in the book, that the United States of America's federal government is really an outfit that is something that's designed to fight the Cold War. If you go back to even the end of World War II, after the New Deal and everything, and look at the size of the federal government compared to what it is now. I mean, you're talking like 1%. I mean, it's so vast now. So everything that was built out in the federal government was built out to fight the Cold War, and the Cold War is over now. And that goes for everything from, say, like the civil rights bureaucracy. Back in the 50s, when the Eisenhower administration was talking about sending the Army down to Alabama to integrate the schools down there, the backroom conversations were about the propaganda value of Jim Crow to the Soviets and everything. And so it was a Cold War imperative to address civil rights. And so even something like that, the whole operation is really set up to fight the Cold War. And now, and in a Cold War, words and symbols count at least as much as deeds, right? And we came to blows with the Soviet Union, the communist world, through a proxy a couple times, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Korea, just a couple times that we came directly to blows. But we were fighting a propaganda information war the entire time. There wasn't a day that went by that the attacks were not being launched and defended against. And that necessitates a tremendous amount of secrecy. And I think that since the advent of the Cold War and up to today, there's a level of secrecy going on at the highest levels of decision making that never would have been tolerated or even considered. I don't think the people in charge would have ever considered that it would have been tolerated for most of our history, but it's just the way things are now. The idea that the citizenry has a right to be informed so that they can partake in the decision-making process, it's just out the window. I mean, that doesn't really exist anymore. And that creates a lot of holes in people's understanding of the world. Those little crevices of secrecy are where conspiracy theories flourish. And they are flourishing. If you look around, they're absolutely flourishing. And you see people who really have otherwise like a very good head on their shoulders can get pretty swept up in it because nobody in any position of official authority is going to give you a compelling answer on questions that we really have every right to expect an answer to,
Well, this stuff is so compartmentalized now that sometimes, it's one chunk of the blob is not getting the information that the other chunks are getting. And so if they're not going to disseminate that information across agencies, they're certainly not going to trickle it down to you, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, you go all the way back 100 years ago, the elitist thinkers back then were worried about this new entity, the public, and the roiling energies that might bubble up in like a Freudian sense. I mean, that really was the model. It had happened in 1917 in Russia. It had happened in 1933 in Germany. And these were mass movements. And you have the public out there, and it's this highly volatile, unstable, and unpredictable thing that can just erupt at any moment, get caught up in manias or whatever. And so this is something that, for their own good, needs to be managed, right? And this is how. And people, I think, the old school progressives back in the day, I think that they meant that in good faith, really. But what that means is if you're managing a population, you don't have a self-governed state. You have something entirely different. And we do have a managed population. And when you consider the all-encompassing nature of media today, I mean, ever since the advent, sure, people were watching 4 or 5 hours of TV a day before the smartphone came out. But as you have documented better than anybody, the smartphone has really changed everything. It's something that, like I've noticed with people sometimes, if they're on their smartphone, they could be looking at an article on ESPN. It doesn't matter. If they're looking at it and you walk up to them, they'll kind of hide their phone a little bit, like, oh, hey, what's up? Because that's private. It just is that way. It doesn't matter. They're not doing anything wrong. It's just an instinct because the intimacy of the smartphone really erases or at least muddies up our ability to distinguish between our own thoughts, our own mind, and the content that we're interacting with. And so it almost becomes an extension of you. I mean, like I said, you've written about this better than anybody. And so that all-consuming nature of the media we consume now means that, you can exercise power over populations in a way that Aldous Huxley and George Orwell never really would have been able to conceive of. And you can do it in a sort of Kojevian way where, it's Stalinism without the death camps, because you can do it in a subtle way that people, that really fools people into thinking that they're making their own decisions half the time. But those decisions are being managed. And I think that, people have a sense deep down for when they're being manipulated, even if it's really successful manipulation, and they're pretty much just brainwashed and on board. There's a voice down in there somewhere that says, that's going to tell you that something doesn't seem right, and that something is reaching out and trying to control you against your will. And people, populations, individuals, whether you're talking about a paranoid who thinks the CIA is monitoring him, or populations as a whole getting into conspiracy theories, thinking that some force is out there, some unidentified force is trying to manipulate you on the sly. I mean, that's the basis of conspiracy theories, really, And people do feel that. And so they think that if they're being manipulated, then they must be being manipulated by someone, and they want to know who that is and what their purpose for all of it is.
Well, it's a harsh lesson, right? Where you're a well-meaning progressive in the 20th century meaning of the word. Someone who's raised to understand that management is this kind of like social or business kind of technology or system that you can use to bring order to a chaotic world. And you say, okay, the passions of the people are being accelerated by technology. The founders were concerned about this, not wanting to dampen the passions too much, but not wanting to accelerate them too fast. So you bicameral legislature, and some of the passions flow into the representatives, and they sort of do their thing, and then it has to go up to the Senate, and sort of slowing down the tempo of that sort of public passion. And that all, okay, fair enough, but they take these approaches which end up pushing people entirely out of political life, with the exception of, okay, you get to vote like once every 2 to 4 years. Probably it's about every 8 years where it's going to be like, this is the big one, you guys. It's like, if we don't win this one, everything's lost. We're doomed. And aside from that, what is people's political involvement? They think of politics. Politics becomes a bad word. Oh, they're just playing politics. I don't want to get involved in the politics. Politics never solves anything. Politics becomes something bad, something that doesn't work anymore, something that doesn't show up for them in their own lives. No one wants to sit on the town council. It's like a bunch of old people who smell funny, sort of like just haranguing each other. It's like public access television. No one wants to do that. So then where does all that energy flow? If it's flowing out of the political system, out of the political process, and it's being pushed out by administration in the public sector, and then it's being pushed out by the management of information in the private sector, quote unquote, then of course you're going to have this, this fever swamp of people who want to apply their energies as citizens, but there's really nowhere for it to show up. So that's like terribly destabilizing.
Yeah, if you go back to the 1960s, you had the student protest movement, you had the civil rights movement, and obviously there was a lot of overlap and interaction, but these are two separate movements with different leadership cores. And something happened in both of them in 1968. Both sides had kind of been, with our inability to slow down the acceleration of the Vietnam War, after the Voting Rights Act was signed in '65, the problems in the northern ghettos still continuing to get worse and not really being addressed. People were starting to lose faith in the official institutions and means of addressing the issues that they're concerned about. But they were still trying. And so if you go to 1968, there was the Clean for Gene campaign. You had all these hippies who were shaving their beards and trimming up their hair all short, and they were going door to door in suit and tie because they were going to go work for the Eugene McCarthy campaign. And they did all that. And people were very enthusiastic about him.
And that was a huge upset in New Hampshire. He almost beat Johnson right out of the gate.
Right. And then the convention comes along, and Hubert Humphrey, who didn't win a single primary, who I think he had 2% total of the primary vote, of the Democratic primary vote, he's more or less just installed as the Democratic nominee. And, this is at a time when the Vietnam War is obviously at its height. People are being threatened with jail if, when they get drafted, they have to go over there. And so this is a question of, Eugene McCarthy was the anti-war candidate. So this was a question for these people who were working on this campaign of life and death. I mean, this was like really a question of, are you going to get sent over into the jungles to fight or not? And they said, okay, well, that's okay then. We're going to use the institutions. We're going to vote for Eugene McCarthy. And then they just got robbed. I mean, just plain and simple got robbed. And so when they started protesting about it in Chicago, the police just came out and kicked the hell out of them. And those people, they lost faith in the system. And where did all their energies go? It went off into the weather underground. It went off into all of these crazy cults that proliferated in the early 1970s. The similar thing happened with the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was able to hold off the worst excesses of Black Power ideology as long as he was alive. People were, especially the younger crowds and the northern crowds, they were pushing against it, but he had enough just residual credibility and moral weight that he was able to do that. And then he was killed. And the civil rights movement lost its mind. The Black Panthers became the center, really, of the Black rights movement in the country. Out in New York, the Black Panthers became the Black Liberation Army, running around killing dozens of police officers in 12 states. And then it just continued to accelerate the madness off into the Symbionese Liberation Army or the Jonestown cult. And so that's something that I really worry about now. Like a small version of it maybe is I remember when Reddit decided to ban the Donald. And I was just like, this is a terrible idea, because here's what's going to happen. This is like, people do this to socialize. This is like a part of their life, People's favorite message board is that you're taking something from them, and they're going to go try to find it somewhere else. And a huge chunk of those people ended up on 4chan and other places that, the most liberal person in the world would say they would have much rather just had corralled them into the Donald and let them have their fun there. But instead, they went off into places that were much less regulated, that had really no constraints on the behavior there. And, some of them took a peek into poll and they were horrified and they walked away, but a lot of them didn't. And so a lot of people got radicalized through that. And, with them coming in now and, they want to arrest Trump. The 2020 election was what it was, as far as I'm concerned. Whether there was voter fraud or not, I'm not really that interested in, just because you don't need voter fraud to say that election was anything but a democratic choice.
Fortified.
Yeah, and those people who put all of their disaffected emotion into this into the Republican Party. Donald Trump was a Republican Party candidate. As much as a lot of Republicans didn't like him or whatever, all of that energy was being funneled into an institution that is a part of our national political sort of, heritage. And when they take him out in an illegitimate way, just like when King was killed, just like when Eugene McCarthy was jobbed, I really worry where that energy is going to head. And you already kind of see it with QAnon and things like that. I know people personally who absolutely smart people who were well put together, who got caught up in that QAnon stuff and lost their minds. One of them ended up in jail because he was like trying to break into a government building somewhere. And this was not a crazy person. This was a guy who, he was a smart, normal dude. I knew him for years, and he reminds me of, there's a guy I knew, he was an engineer who worked for Amgen back in Thousand Oaks. And this guy was like 60 years old, super smart guy, knew his wife and family for a long time, knew him. And he got caught up in the flat earth thing one time, and he was dead set convinced. This is an educated man. This is an engineer at Amgen, And those things can grab you. And when there's a political edge to it, politics is inherently dangerous. And that's something that we don't acknowledge often enough, which is that, and I mean psychologically and emotionally dangerous for people. It sets up us versus them thinking. You have people who are in conflict, sometimes intense conflict with each other over issues they care very deeply about, things that go right to the core of how their society's organized and their personal, individual and rights. And in order to participate in politics on a regular basis, and I don't mean going to vote every 2 or 4 years, but the way people do it now with their smartphones, where it's every day they're engaged in politics, to not to maintain your equilibrium, you've got to be a pretty solid, well put together person who, because it's not the natural thing to do. The natural thing is to become paranoid. It's to become polarized. That's what politics does, And it's one of the reasons I think that, democracies don't necessarily die by conquest or suicide. I think they if democracy dies, it'll be because people are tired of it, And think about back to the Roman Empire, right? When Caesar came along and why he had so much support from the people on the ground. And, it wasn't just the bread and circuses and the pomp and circumstance. It was that he came and said, look, you guys have been just ripping each other's throats out for like the last 100 years. How about you guys don't participate in politics anymore? You're not a part of the decision-making processes of the state. But all that stuff you've been fighting about, that's all done. And so you think about that in a modern context. If somebody were to come along and say, okay, here's the deal. You don't get to vote anymore. But all of this like racial animosity, all of this, just the ideological wars that you're having, you guys get to forget about all that. You can just go grill. You can just go live your lives like you really want to do. It's very tempting.
Very tempting. Because at home, like your home's on fire too. Your neighborhood's toast. Your family's falling apart. Addiction, suicide, it's everywhere. People know that they need to tend to those things, and they don't think they have the bandwidth to do it all.
I live in San Diego, and San Diego, obviously it's a California big city, but there's a huge military and DoD element there that keeps it a little more conservative, a little more sane than the other big cities on the West Coast. But I just can't believe what I'm seeing sometimes. Like I'll go down to Hillcrest, which is the nice, it's the gay neighborhood in San Diego. Very cool, walkable neighborhood, great restaurants, great shops, used bookstores, all that kind of stuff. It's not like any kind of a red light district. It's a great neighborhood, always has been. One of the most desirable places in San Diego, a place that you would take somebody on a first date to go walk around. And you go down there now, this happened. I was out to dinner with my buddy and my goddaughter, little girl, 3 years old, and walked out of this place, and we had to step over a guy smoking crack right in front of the door. And I'm like, this is a place people bring their families. Like, why do I have to look at this? Why do I have to explain? She's only 3, but if she was 8, I would have to explain to her what was going on there. And that's a conversation that I should be able to have on my own schedule, with my little girl, his little girl. And people are, I think, getting inured to a level of disorder that would have been unthinkable not that long ago. And sometimes I think that the where that comes from in America, and I see this even myself. I mean, a lot of people out here in Dallas who have come from places like California. If you think about it, Americans were formed out of the misfits of Europe, right? Whether it was the Puritans or the Southern Italian peasant or, the Eastern European Pale settlement Jew, whatever it was, all the different people coming in because things were just not satisfactory back where they came from. They didn't fit in for whatever reason. And they came here for a better life. The misfits of Europe and then the misfits of the rest of the world. And you show up on the East Coast and you start your cities, your colonies. And then the people who really still couldn't fit in even there and on the East Coast, well, they moved west a little bit. And they moved, the people, it's just, it's like following the Mormon path, right? Like you're just getting chased out of town after town after town, and you're heading west. And of course, you eventually crash into the Pacific Ocean. So the West Coast is crazier than anywhere else because those are the people who couldn't fit in anywhere. But I wonder sometimes if the presence of the frontier for all of our formative history has sort of engendered a mentality where nobody thinks, my community's going to hell. I have to do something about this. I have to fight this. This is my home. Everybody thinks, man, I'm moving to Texas. California is going to the birds. I'm moving to Idaho.
There's always an escape hatch.
There's always an escape hatch.
But is there still?
Well, so yeah,
it's getting crowded.
Yeah,
in the escape hatch.
Eventually, you run out of places to run, and that's going to be the. I mean, that's if things keep continuing down the path they're going, that is the point where there's going to be a real confrontation. When you reach the point where liberal Boise can tell the rest of Idaho what to do, and when Bozeman and Missoula can tell Montana what to do, and so forth. We're going to be at decision time as to, how we want to keep this project going. Because you can't just ignore half the country and shunt them out of the political process, declare that they are essentially beneath representation. You can't just do that and expect it to go on for a long time, even if their grievances are like illegitimate in a way. I had this conversation with somebody, I guess maybe it was during the George Floyd riots. And Sam Harris had put out this podcast about police violence, police shootings. And he's a very kind of, rationalistic type, statistical oriented person. So he's laying out all these stats about that were basically demonstrating that the hysteria over the idea that there's a bunch of cops shooting a bunch of African Americans around the country is not really based on anything. Because if you look at just all the different things, that it just wasn't really an issue. And I was talking to my buddy about how, it doesn't matter if it's an issue or not. If you have like a majority of the black population in this country, which you did at the time, who think that that's true, who don't trust the police and think that they're in danger when they come into contact with them, whether or not that's statistically true or not, that is a political issue that you have to address. You can't just let that fester and go on because, they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the numbers, so forget about it. You can't do that. And with that issue, we kind of get that. But then we do it with with a much larger group of people. Whether you just want to restrict it to MAGA or more and more, especially like you live out in California and people who are Republicans, and I'm talking Orange County liberal Republicans, they keep it to themselves these days. And because there are people out there who they won't be able to leave it alone. They just won't. And so people don't do it. And when you get to a point like that, where even liberal Republicans are hiding their views in Orange County, eventually that pressure is going to build up because all their grievances, it's not like they go away. They just get pushed underground. Nobody's really allowed to talk about them in the, it's similar to how like conspiracy theories form, right? Like anytime you have a subject that is just set about with taboos, and there are very defined ways of how you're allowed to talk about this, and you don't go outside certain boundaries and everything. Just by definition, the narrative on whatever that is, because it's something approaching like more like a myth, right? When you have that, and anytime you have that, there's going to be holes in the story, because if you don't have the free and open kind of exchange of ideas on something, then there are just going to be holes in the story, and those holes are what people key on when So you think about like, that's
what the frontier is. Suddenly. Yeah, it's a psychic frontier. Look, I agree with all that. Here's where I get worried. You see the way that the political left in America went from anti-corporate, anti-war, anti-surveillance, into the opposite of that movement. How did that happen? Well, they took that constituency and they broke its spirit. They just broke it. And as they began that process of breaking that constituency, like you said, energy flowed into cults. It flowed into, crackpot movements. It flowed into terrorism, domestic extremism.
It flowed into academia, which is funny that that's on that list. But
it did flow into academia, and we'll get to that in a minute. But by and large, they pushed people to a psychic breaking point. And when they reached that breaking point, they became willing to just hand themselves over to the regime. The same thing is happening now to the right. The right has now adopted all of those same positions. There was nowhere else for those positions to go. And the same process of breaking that movement is happening. The surveillance, the feds, the doxing, the pressure campaign wherever you go, the 47% deplorables, just overt political oppression. And what you see at the elite level, at least among younger people, is what you saw unfold on the left in the 70s. You have all these factions and subgroups and total paranoia, backstabbing, gurus, just sort of shifting micro alignments that never amount to anything and become increasingly marginalized from American political life. And gosh darn it, you see it happening on the right. Right now, everyone's fracturing into their little groups, irreconcilable differences. Everyone's suspicious that there's a mole inside of their organization or that someone's going to sell them out or leak their texts or whatever. And it's like we've seen this story before and we've seen how it goes. And we've seen that the goal is the same. The goal is now to do to the Republican Party what was done to the Democrats. And yeah, some of that energy can be pushed into places where it erupts here and there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing from the point of view of the people who are trying to terraform the population. Because then you can say, see, just like we told you, they were going to freak out and try to attack you, attack this country, have a revolution. So we're going to stomp on those people. We're going to snuff it out. And that's a further reinforcement of the fact that you need us at the top. We understand what's going on and you don't. We have all the weapons and you don't. If it's not us, then America is going to collapse and you're going to be ruled by China or you're going to be ruled by Vladimir Putin or whatever. It's becoming this kind of airtight system where these demoralization campaigns, they worked so well on the left that now they're shifting to do it on the right. And with the exception of very few individuals, they're making an impact. They took Trump out several times. Kanye West is gone. Tucker's off the air. I mean, you run down Peter Thiel's been like it's a systematic process and it's working.
It is working, and people who are alienated from their own society. Look, or I'll put it this way. It's fine to have a couple revolutionaries in your society, or even to have like a sort of a subculture of revolution in your country, just a gadfly kind of people who think the system's illegitimate. They're against every war and they don't want to talk about it. They think that there's a conspiracy behind. That's actually fine to have. That keeps the rest of us honest to some degree. But you don't want everybody in your society having that kind of a polarized revolutionary mentality. And you want most people going to work and raising their families and just feeling like they can take for granted that if the president goes on the news and tells them something that sure, there might be certain things that they got to hide because of this or that, or maybe like there's a certain bias for his political prospects that he's holding back on, whatever, but that basically he's not just completely gaslighting me. And people don't have that feeling anymore. I mean, people don't trust anything anymore, except for, what happens is like when people don't trust any of the institutions, what they do is they trust their own tribe, and that's it. They say, well, you know what? I don't really care what comes out of the other side. I'm going to listen to Tucker because at least I know Tucker doesn't actively hate me. And so I'm going to listen to him.
They want to hear a voice that's not in their own head.
Yeah. And it's really tough. Like, I'll tell you, like, I'm pretty pessimistic about what it would take to actually reform federal politics in a way that would really be lasting and meaningful. I mean, you look at, to take a recent example, look at Trump's immigration reforms, right? People complain and build the wall or whatever, but if you actually look at the numbers of immigrants coming into the United States at the end of his term, it was down like, 75% or something like that. It was significantly down by the end. But then Joe Biden comes into office and, 250,000, we're adding the city of Seattle every 3 months to the United States ever since Joe Biden came into office. So they're making up for lost time. And so, whether the federal government can really be, and federal politics in general, which is where everybody's attention is obviously because that's what's on TV, whether that can be meaningfully changed. I don't know. But what I do know is that your municipality and your states can be turned into fortresses and weapons to fight back against this. And that, you can have an oasis of sanity, because as much as they might want to override it and treat everything as if it's George Wallace in the 1950s, standing in front of a university door, and they're going to send the army down to enforce it. As much as they might want to do that, the fact is, states and municipalities, something like a county sheriff, they have a tremendous amount of constitutional power, and it would, they would have to break the system to really break through and take that down. Maybe they would do that, but then that's fine. Make them do it if that's where they're going to go.
Well, yeah. So this begs some questions, and there's some folks out there who are like, it's all bullshit. I'm not voting. I'm never going to vote again. Doesn't matter. They're not going to let Trump in. They won't let DeSantis in either. They're not going to let anyone in. Is this convincing to you? You mentioned Caesar a little while ago. Some people are like, or Sulla. Someone's just going to have to ride in and just like make it all go away. It's difficult to be forecasting these kinds of things. But in the same way that it's like, what's ultimately backstopping the value of the dollar? They say it's the full faith and credit of the United States government. Well, it's the full faith and credit of the American people. And if you get to a point where there's just one, you add one more person who's like, what, this isn't real. This is all imaginary, and it's all this sort of simulation created by people who are so disconnected from me and so disconnected from my experience that I'm out. When you cross that line, your currency is in trouble. And when you cross that line politically, where people, enough people get to the point where it's like Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. This thing is broken and it's never going to be fixed. Once you get to that point, then it's even harder to predict what happens. But the question is, do you think that we're about to get to that point?
I think there's a confrontation coming. Yeah, I think that, and I don't know what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a violent confrontation or anything like that. But,
well, how many countries in the West over the past 10 years have not experienced that sort of thing?
Yeah.
France is going through it, right now.
Yeah. But, it's the problem of mass democracy in a way, right? Or maybe just say democracy in the mass media age, put it that way, where, you get to vote, and let's just assume that the elections are legitimate and actually mean something. And if one person gets more votes, then that person wins the election. You're one of 150 million voters in a national election. Do you really have representation? And I think people are they're well into the process of feeling that they don't have representation, that these people don't represent them. And, the problem is it's harder for people to imagine, it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world than it is for them to imagine a real transformation in the way we do politics or the economy even for that matter. And, the way that this used to function, we used to have a society that was built from the bottom up, right? Where you had people, they lived in, at least let's say up in the northern cities, in the big cities, you had people who lived in corporate communities, ethnic neighborhoods, with local leaders who were, de facto, they weren't local politicians or anything, but they were leaders in the community. And sometimes those people would go represent that community at the city. Those people were members of labor unions. They were members of churches that were actually community centers and not just a place to hang out on Sunday for an hour or two.
They weren't sent off to college, so that thread was not broken.
Yeah, they had all of these intermediate institutions between themselves, the individual, and the state. And over the course of, it's really obviously accelerated since the 1960s, but that's really just when the coup de grace started to be delivered. All of those things have been wiped out for the most part. And so those things, even though it's not as if your labor union got a vote, but that was a powerful means of representation in a democratic society, is you had this labor union that could press, it could lobby the government for you. It could, and within the labor union, you voted on everything. This is a democratic organization within the union, but then the union acts on your behalf, like once you've elected the leadership there. And that was like a powerful form of representation. It was a powerful form of representation to be Irish and have the Catholic Church in New York City for most of, the history there. And so that gave people a sense that, or even just, you could, if you knew somebody, you could actually, like even in a place like New York City, up until the 50s, you could, if you lived in, say, like an Irish neighborhood, if you knew somebody who was even half a step higher on the social ladder than you, which everybody did, right? There's somebody at your church or you're just your priest for that matter, that person knew somebody who was one step ahead, above them, and so on and so forth. And if you had something that needed to be communicated to the people who were running the city, and it was important enough and couldn't be solved at one of those lower levels or addressed, it would make its way up there. Like you had representation in that sense. And, those structures are all evaporated now. Today we have a bunch of deracinated individuals in weak families that, and the families no longer looked at something as that has any kind of solidity, as a permanent institution for people. It's just as fluid as everything else. And all of those other ways other than voting that people felt like their voice was being heard and their concerns were being addressed by the people who were in charge. With all of those things gone, all you have is voting, and people now, they kind of have to admit to themselves that voting, you can call it democracy and self-representation and self-governance all you want, but in practice, it really doesn't work out that way. The mass media, democratic politics is something that, first of all, obviously, it means that you can't run for office without millions or probably billions pretty soon of dollars, because you've got to have the media access. You've got to have messaging that appeals to people at a mass level, which not only dumbs things down, but really almost necessitates, whether or not a politician would like to do this or not, it necessitates demagoguery. It necessitates emotional appeals. It necessitates, because if you don't do it, then somebody else will, and they're probably going to beat you. And so everybody does it. And
even the managers of this system realize that it sucks. That's why they want to bump us up to world government. I mean, they're offering us the pod or the world, and nothing in the middle. And what we've had up until now, especially in the U.S., is it's all about the middle. It's about, if you have a neighborhood that is your own, if you have a city, a town that's your own, like that's world enough.
Yeah.
You can live a full life with all the sort of drama and richness and joy and suffering and, the full panoply of human experience. You can have a rich and full life and watch it continue on through your church or your club or your offspring or whatever. And now that's being leached away. The city's being turned into something that's almost like post-human in that sense.
It is, full of transients. Like living in San Diego, I can tell you, like when I meet somebody my own age who is from San Diego, it's always shocking because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
It's a city of transients. That's why the Padres can't fill up even like a playoff game, And it reminds me when I was over in Israel for work a couple years ago, and I had a couple weeks to spare because of a snafu with my scheduling. And so I was out there and I got to kind of go around the region a little bit and explore. And I had a driver take me out to the West Bank, and we were driving around some of the different Palestinian communities. And one thing that, it stands out immediately when you get out there is if you go to like Ramallah, the cities, they're not like Beverly Hills or anything, but they're fine. They're fine. You feel like you're in a city like in any other part of the world. You go to the refugee camps, and they are a disaster. They're filthy. They're destroyed. And why wouldn't they be? That's not their home, And so they don't have that sense of attachment and responsibility to this place. This is always just something that hopefully, if like things work out, that they're going to leave tomorrow, ideally, And so you think about like when I was coming here actually today in the airport, there was a magazine in one of the little airport bookstores, Fast Company or something like that, and it had some little mini headline on there that I've seen. I must have seen this headline 100 times in the last 20 years about how the in the future people aren't going to have people are going to change careers 6, 7 times like throughout their life, and the chief skill for people is not going to be having some particular skill. It's how well can you adapt, how well can you learn new skills and things like that. And I thought, like, you tell young people you're going to change careers 6 times in your life, even change jobs. It said careers, which seems a little weird to me, but let's just say jobs. You're going to change jobs 6 or 7 times over the course of your life. That means every 6 years, maybe at most, you're gonna leave the place you're at and go somewhere else. A lot of those are going to mean you're moving cities or you're moving states. Or the other people who you work with, if you don't do it, they're going to do it. So everybody's coming and going. It's a huge turnover rate in just everywhere. I mean, whether you're talking about a community, companies, there's just huge turnover rates. And as a result, everybody has that refugee camp mentality where there's no attachment to this place. It might be worth fighting for, but it's not their job to fight for it. It's not theirs. It's not something that is their job to fix. And and it also, it tells people, like, don't bother making really deep friendships. Why would you? You're going to leave, or they're going to leave, one of the two. Don't get too attached to a neighborhood. Don't get involved with local politics. Why would you do that? Because, if you're going to be gone in 5 years, why would you waste any time worrying about local? And so all of these things just go away, and and people don't feel rooted. People are just free floating, without any grounding from all of these old institutions that used to tie them down to something. And when you have a population like that, it's a highly volatile population. Like, a population that's undergoing tremendous change that's a population of misfits in a way. Well, I guess it's almost by definition. You think about, like, all the revolutions that happened in the former colonial world, right? The former European colonies. And it's really interesting because, we have this idea that that a revolution happens to effect massive change in a society, that maybe things just get so degraded and so bad and so unbearable that the people rise up and have a revolution to overhaul the entire thing. But if you look at the history of the colonial countries, the ex-colonial countries, that's really not what happened at all.
That's right.
What actually happened is the revolutions came after they improved their condition. After you actually had a middle class, people who went to college in Paris or whatever it is, like, as things begun to improve. And I think the reason for that is that, the Western countries took these places over, these places that were peasant societies. People lived in their small towns and villages with their extended families, very rooted, very grounded. And the Western way of life, at least of the colonial countries, I should say, it's obviously not so much the case in southern Italy or Greece or something maybe, but the northern Western European, like, nuclear family model and that sense of always being on the move, it dislocated people and pulled them out of those sockets that they had been in before. You saw the same thing happen with the African-American population in America. The African-American population in America. You saw the same thing happen after the Great Migration. It's for all of the, awfulness of Jim Crow, in a million different ways, and not just materially, and not just because of crime and drugs and everything. Their lives were infinitely worse in the northern and western cities after they made the Great Migration. Because at least in the South, they lived in a place where they had always lived. And so they're not only did they know everybody in the community, their parents had known everybody in their generation in the community, and so on and so forth. And you can get through a lot of just sort of economic and physical discomfort if you have something like that. If you don't have something like that, it doesn't matter how rich you are. It doesn't matter how easy your life is. Those people are going to go crazy. And it's, you know, I mean, I think you look around today and people are going crazy.
If and when the confrontation that you're talking about comes to pass, what are the events over the past 15 years that you think we'd be able to look back at and say, like, this was the moment when it really started to escalate? Is it Epstein? Is it 9/11? Is it Afghanistan? Is it Iraq? I mean, there are a number of them to choose from. Financial crisis. Which are the ones that really stick out to you as milestones in the breakdown?
All of those would probably qualify, but I'll say the financial crisis. Because of when it came, you know, the Generation X, our generation's not real big and we're not real influential. Millennials are a big generation. There's a ton of them, and they are, you know, they're crazy like their grandparents, the boomers, were. And so very engaged, very political. And it came right at a time where, like, your mid-aged millennials were coming out of college and they were going to go look for a job. You know, my wife, she's a few years younger than me. And, you know, 9/11 happened when she was 15 years old. So she was a sophomore in high school, and they're in class watching the Twin Towers come down on TV. And then her entire life, because she wasn't political at that point, she was 15 years old. And so politics to her, for her entire life, has been America's out there at war. Maybe it's an evil imperial war or whatever. There's terrorist threats every day, you know, with color-coded levels of threat.
And whatever it is, it's not really working. I mean, yeah, there hasn't been another 9/11, but there's been other stuff over and over again.
Yeah, and politics throughout her entire life, as long as she's been aware of politics, has been, you're a Nazi, you're a communist, these people are trying to destroy the country, and if they get control, then that is exactly what they'll do. That's been the only politics my wife has ever known. She finishes college in 2007 or 2008, which is a great time to finish college and start going out and look for a career. And that was her whole cohort, you know? And so finally, after, you know, she finds herself, her and her whole generation find herself in competition for jobs with people who got 20 years of experience and they just got laid off. They finally start to put it back together in 2020, you know, or by 2020, and then you get COVID that comes along. And it's you know, maybe COVID's really the one. I mean, actually, now that I think, that's really probably the one that I think is going to, that we will look back on as a Rubicon that got crossed.
You think they're going to do it again?
They could. You know, at this point, I don't trust my own instincts because, like, early on in COVID, like, I remember, for example, when the riots were going on in May and June of 2020, and you had all the public health experts coming out and, you know, saying, not even downplaying the threat or anything. They were actually saying that these protests, I mean, this was in the middle of COVID. This was in like late May, right? So, I mean, I lived on the beach at the time. There were literally sheriffs out there under a canopy with drones. They were flying around with speakers on them. And they were going, if people stopped moving, stopped walking on the beach, they would go over there and be like, get moving. So that's how things were. And then the riots happened. You have massive crowds of people in every city in America. And the public health authorities come out and totally co-sign it and say that, in fact, having these protests is a public health, you know, emergency, because racism is a public health emergency. And so it was surreal to see that happening. But then I remember looking at my wife and saying, well, at least after this, there's no way they can tell us to go back in our houses. Like, there's just no way. And she just looked at me like I was a fool. My wife's Armenian. They're like, you know, they're a little more wise in that sense, maybe. Yeah, they know what it's like to live under a predatory state, you know, that they don't identify with. And she said, you're crazy. She said, they're definitely going to make us go back in our house. I was like, no way. If they try to do that, why, people will they'll go crazy. They won't take it. And of course they did, and nobody, you know, did anything. They closed our churches for like a year. They closed our schools for like a year. People were getting arrested for going to church. And I was always of the mindset that there's just no way. The American people, say what you want about them, but we don't like being told what to do. We buck when authority gets too strict on us. It doesn't matter who you are. Nobody likes a snitch. You know, it's something I always thought is that, like, as long as, because every American, rich, poor, middle class, like whatever, for most of our history, nobody liked a snitch. Nobody likes a tattletale. Unless there's something that's done that's really heinous that like the cops need to know about because this person's dangerous. Everybody looks a little bit. I know people that think that the Unabomber's brother was totally in the wrong for reporting his brother to the FBI, and I honestly have mixed feelings about it myself. But like, that was built into the American idea that nobody likes a snitch because you're on the side of other citizens, and the government's on the other side of that fence, and you guys have to deal with this thing together.
Do you think Ukraine's falling into that pattern too?
In what
How that's
sense?
shaping up? Just like another conflict where it's just like the checks are blank and the results are not really forthcoming and the rhetoric keeps ratcheting up and there's no end in sight, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that it's one of those things that like you can't even really. A few years ago, you wouldn't have been able to believe it. That we're locked into a completely open-ended war with like you said, a completely open checkbook. That they're telling us we have to win at any costs, and we have a president whose family was taking payoffs that were certainly bribes. I mean, I think any honest person has to look at that and say that that's what was going on.
That's how business is done, and not just out there.
And I think somebody said to me the other day that all of our institutions break down in a system of in a condition of serious polarization, where you get to the point where I know people who are Democrats who it took a long time to convince them. It took them a long time. It took me a long time to like get through, but they know that the Russiagate thing, for example, was completely made up, and that it was just an information and police operation against Trump and his people. They understand that now, and they're fine with it because they think that the other side is such a threat that like, well, yeah, if like German intelligence was able to look at this Hitler guy in 1933 and say, well, we can't allow him to win, then that would have been a good thing. And when you get that polarized, where you're willing to not just overlook, but cheer on blatant treason, blatant sedition, corruption, generals not obeying the president or lying to him about troop levels in Syria, and people think that that's fine. And it's not just people on the ground who sometimes pop off about politics. You can read Max Boot or whoever, David French, say, the deep state is real, and it's a great thing that we have it because it's there to protect us. And that's something that I just didn't think was in the American mentality. And I don't know. Maybe I should have known better because I spent a fair amount of. I've traveled around the world for my old job quite a bit, and I remember being in Greece, in like down in southern Italy around Naples, a lot of other places, and being shocked because just by the way people drove. People would passing me on the shoulder, and it was the Wild West if you're an American, because you take it for granted out here. But we are rule followers. We're basically a very pro-social people for all of our history of revolution and anti-government and all that kind of stuff. We're a pretty pro-social and obedient people. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. People hear a siren, and it is a huge exception if everybody on the street doesn't pull over to the side so that the ambulance or the fire truck can get through. Everybody just does it.
A lot of America's a big grid.
Right,
you got the big highways, you got your town, it's just on a grid, and it's very mathematical.
And so maybe I should have seen it coming, and just realized that when push comes to shove, it doesn't matter who you are or what country you're talking about. Most people are going to do what they're told and go along with it. But the mass democratic politics is mob politics. There's no other way around it. That's just what it is. And mobs, they follow strength. That's what they do, And it's one of the it's one of the things I wish the Republican Party would get through their head, which is that when you have in mass politics, if you don't show strength, people are going to have absolute contempt for you. And the Democrats understand that, or I should say, even the establishment understands that, maybe, because it's it's not really so much of a partisan thing. If Tulsi Gabbard had been running against Jeb Bush, then James Comey would have been running a spying operation on Tulsi Gabbard. So,
I got a feeling that next time we talk, there are going to be more fun historic events under our belt. That's how fast things are going. I know a lot of people are going to know this information already, but why don't you just quickly tell the people where they can find you, where they can keep up?
So I make the Martyr Made podcast. I just put out an episode. It is 7 hours long, and it is about a teacher's strike in New York City in 1968, which might sound like a boring topic. I assure you it is not. Martyrmade.substack.com is where I do business, and I have a podcast I do with my friend Jocko Willink called Jocko Unraveling, or The Unraveling. And we do that one more frequently than I put out my other podcast, and we talk about more contemporary issues as well as historical stuff. So
very good, Daryl. Thanks for joining us. That is literally now all the time we have. I see zeros across the screen. Until next time, this is Zero Hour. I am James Poulos, and may God have mercy on us.